Captain returns after years to find his daughter locked in the basement. When he sees her belly, he turns pale upon realizing that the girl had a. Eduardo Salazar stepped out of the taxi, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The harbor breeze felt colder than he remembered, as if something intangible had changed during his time away. He looked at the front of his house. Dirty walls, a withered garden, and an overflowing mailbox greeted him. Something was wrong. He took a deep breath, adjusted his captain's hat, and walked toward the front door. As he stepped inside, the smell hit him like a slap. Mold, rotten food, and something else he couldn't immediately identify. His boots echoed on the wooden floor, which creaked with every step. The walls were bare, missing the family photos that had once adorned them. The sense of abandonment was suffocating. Valeria. Sophia, he called out, his voice echoing through the empty house. No one answered. He climbed the stairs, checking the rooms. Everything was in disarray. In the master bedroom, the drawers were empty and the bed was stripped of sheets. In Sophia's room, broken toys were piled in a corner. Eduardo felt a knot form in his stomach, a mix of worry and anger. He had spent years away, working tough missions and sending money every month to ensure his family's well-being. This was not what he had expected to come home to. Suddenly, a dull noise from the basement startled him. He rushed down the stairs, pushing open the door to that forgotten part of the house. What he saw froze him in place. There, in a dark corner, was Sophia, curled up and surrounded by filth. Her pale skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim basement light, and her sunken eyes struggled to focus on him. She was covered in a fine layer of dust, with strands of hair stuck to her sweaty forehead. In her hands, she clutched a piece of moldy bread, trying to chew it with difficulty. "Sophia!" Eduardo exclaimed, rushing toward her. The girl recoiled, clutching the bread as if her life depended on it. "No, don't hit me, Dad," she murmured, her voice hoarse and shaky. Eduardo stopped in his tracks, stunned. Sophia's words hit him harder than any storm he'd faced at sea. What was she saying? Why was she looking at him with such fear? "Sophia, it's me, Dad. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." He knelt in front of her, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. The girl stared at him, trembling as silent tears streamed down her cheeks. "Where's your mom?" Eduardo asked, trying to stay calm. Sophia didn't respond. She only pointed to her stomach, which was alarmingly swollen. Eduardo moved closer carefully and lifted her into his arms. Her body was light, fragile, as if he were holding a wounded bird. Sophia's skin burned under his touch. "My God!" Eduardo exclaimed, feeling the heat of the fever consuming his daughter. Without wasting a second, he ran out into the street with Sophia in his arms. He found a taxi and, in a voice both firm and desperate, ordered the driver to take them to the nearest hospital. In the emergency room, a doctor quickly examined Sophia. Eduardo stayed by her side, holding her hand as she muttered incoherent phrases, words he could barely understand. The doctor, a man with a tired but kind face, finally approached Eduardo. "This girl is severely dehydrated and has a high fever. If you hadn't brought her in now, she wouldn't have survived much longer. We're going to stabilize her, but she'll need extensive treatment. We've also detected something else. She has a developing tumor, likely caused by the physical and emotional stress she's endured." Eduardo felt the ground collapse beneath him. He looked at his daughter, now connected to several tubes and monitors, and guilt washed over him like an unrelenting tide. "What do you mean by emotional stress?" he asked, his voice trembling. The doctor looked at him with a mix of compassion and firmness. "She seems to have suffered severe abuse. Were you aware of this?" Before Eduardo could respond, Sophia opened her eyes and spoke in a weak but clear voice. "Mom said you weren't coming back, that it was your fault we were like this. She hit me and said it was all we had." Eduardo felt the air leave his lungs. His daughter, his little Sophia, had lived through hell while he was away. But what devastated him most were her next words. "But I love her, Dad. She's my mom. Eduardo leaned over the bed, holding his daughter's small hand as tears streamed down his face. How could he explain to Sofia that love isn't always enough, that the people who are supposed to protect us sometimes hurt us? And how could he forgive himself for not being there to stop it? The doctor's voice interrupted his thoughts. We need to start the treatment immediately. First, we'll stabilize his condition, and then we'll assess the tumor. It's going to be a long process, but there is hope. Eduardo nodded, wiping away his tears with the back of his hand. He looked at Sofia, who was watching him with eyes full of confusion and fear. He silently promised himself that he would do everything possible to protect her from now on. Over the next few hours, Eduardo stayed by Sofia's bedside while the medical staff worked. Every time she woke up, he was there, speaking softly to her, reassuring her that everything would be fine. But deep in his heart, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. When they were finally alone, Sofia spoke again. Why isn't Mom here? Where is she? Eduardo took a deep breath before answering. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also couldn't tell her the whole truth right away. Mom, she's no longer with us, Sofia. She left some time ago. The little girl stared at him, as if trying to process what she had just heard. Finally, she nodded slowly and closed her eyes, exhausted. Eduardo leaned over and kissed her forehead. I'll take care of you, my daughter. You'll never be alone again. But as he said these words, he couldn't help but wonder, what else would he discover about the lost years? What secrets were still hidden in that house? And most importantly, how would he face the future now that everything he had taken for granted had collapsed? He knew the answers wouldn't come easily, but he was determined to fight for them, for Sofia, for his broken family. The next morning, the dawn brought with it a faint ray of hope that crossed through the hospital window, illuminating Sofia's pale face. Eduardo hadn't slept. He had stayed by his daughter's bedside all night, his mind trapped in a whirlwind of unanswered questions. What had happened during his absence? How did his daughter end up in the state? The word tumor echoed in his head like a sentence. His world had changed, and he needed to rebuild it piece by piece. The nurse entered the room to check on Sofia, breaking the uncomfortable silence, disturbed only by the beeping of the monitors. Eduardo seized the opportunity to step into the hallway and find a moment of clarity. He walked to a small waiting room and sank into a chair. He pulled out his phone and began dialing numbers, searching for answers. He first called an old neighbor, then a friend of Valeria's. The stories he heard left him with a knot in his stomach. Eduardo, I'm sorry, but Valeria changed a lot while you were away, one of them said. She met people who weren't trustworthy. We tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't listen. What people? What did they do? Eduardo asked, gripping the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I don't know much. All I know is that she started seeing a man named Raul. They say he was involved in shady business. The name made Eduardo feel a surge of anger. Raul. He had heard it before in one of Valeria's sporadic letters, but he never imagined it was more than just an acquaintance. He hung up without saying goodbye and headed to the hospital reception desk. I need someone to watch my daughter for a few hours, he told the nurse. I need to take care of something important. He went back to his old house, which now seemed more like a mausoleum than a home. The daylight made the decay even more evident. He climbed the stairs with determination, checking drawers, closets, any place where Valeria might have left a clue about what she had been doing. It was at the back of a closet that he found a locked wooden box. He took it down to the basement and, with effort, broke the lock. Inside were documents, photographs, and something that took his breath away, an envelope full of cash, with bills of various denominations. Among the papers, there was a list of names and numbers, some crossed out. Eduardo felt a chill run through him as he examined the documents. Everything pointed to illegal dealings. But what caught his attention the most was a letter addressed to him. He opened it with trembling hands and began to read. Eduardo, if you're reading this, it's because I'm no longer here. I know I failed as a mother and a wife. I made mistakes that I regret every day, but I did it out of desperation. Things got out of control. I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong. Please take care of Sofia. She is not to blame for my decisions. I'm sorry. Valeria. Rage and sadness intertwined in his chest. How had Valeria gotten to this point? He stood up with the letter in his hand, determined to find someone who could give him more answers. He returned to the hospital in the afternoon. Sophia was awake, her eyes slightly more animated. Her small hand held a glass of water she was trying to drink with difficulty. Eduardo approached and stroked her hair. "How do you feel, my love?" he asked. "A little better," the little girl replied softly. Eduardo noticed that Sophia seemed more relaxed, though the shadow of what had happened was still there. He took the opportunity to speak with her. "Sophia, I need you to tell me something. Do you remember if Mom took you anywhere special? Did she mention someone named Raul?" The girl blinked as if trying to sort out her memories. "Raul. Yes, he came sometimes. Mom said he was her friend, but I didn't like him. He was always angry and yelled at Mom." Eduardo's heart raced. Sophia continued speaking. "One time, Mom hid something in the basement. She said if someone came, I shouldn't say anything. But I don't know what it was." Eduardo tried not to show his distress. He kissed Sophia's forehead and promised her that everything would be okay. That same night, Eduardo decided to search for Raul. There was a name in the documents that seemed useful, and he wouldn't rest until he had answers. His investigation led him to a dark bar on the outskirts of the city. The place was filled with smoke and suspicious glances. He approached the bartender and showed him a photo he had found among Valeria's belongings. "Do you know this man?" he asked. The bartender glanced sideways and shook his head. Eduardo didn't give up. He spent hours asking questions and showing the photo until, finally, someone agreed to speak. "Raul was here a few months ago," said a man with a deep voice. "But he doesn't come around anymore. They say he got into trouble with someone bigger." Eduardo felt his frustration grow. Each answer seemed to pull him further from the truth. But he couldn't stop. He went home, more determined than ever. In the following days, Eduardo divided his time between taking care of Sophia and continuing his investigation. Every small breakthrough seemed to open a new door into Valeria's dark past. He found out that she had been involved in a money laundering network and that she had used some of the money he sent to pay off dangerous debts. His feelings were conflicting, sadness for the woman he had loved and anger for the harm she had caused his daughter. Sophia, for her part, was starting to recover. Though still weak, her smile was beginning to return. Eduardo knew he couldn't let the past catch up with her any more than it already had. But the deeper he dug, the clearer it became that the shadow of Valeria and Raul would not disappear so easily. One afternoon, while going over the documents he had found once again, Eduardo noticed a detail he had missed, an address written on the back of a photograph. His intuition told him to investigate. Arriving at the address, he found an abandoned warehouse. The windows were broken and the door hung loosely on its hinges. He entered cautiously, his heart pounding. The place was empty, but on the floor, he found burnt scraps of paper. Among the ashes, he discerned a name, Sophia. Rage flooded him. This was no longer just about Valeria. He now knew his daughter was at the center of something much bigger than he had imagined. Eduardo left the warehouse with renewed purpose. He would not stop until he ensured Sophia was safe. The ghosts of the past haunted him, but they also gave him the strength to move forward. The answers were close, and Eduardo was ready to face them, no matter the cost. The echo of his footsteps resonated in the abandoned warehouse as Eduardo walked through it, his fists clenched and a mixture of anger and determination burning inside him. The ashes of the burnt papers crackled under his boots. These fragments gave him a terrifying certainty. The mob not only knew Valeria, but somehow his daughter was at the center of their attention. The name Sophia written among the ashes made it clear that there was something Valeria had not told him. Eduardo returned to the hospital with a heart on fire and an increasing sense of urgency. Walking into Sophia's room, he saw her sleeping, her small figure connected to wires and tubes that seemed fragile compared to her courage. Her breathing was calm, but her skin was still too pale for his liking. A nurse approached to give a report on the girl's condition. Eduardo listened attentively, but his mind was elsewhere. Every word about Sofia's medical progress mixed with images of Valeria, Raul, and those who had put what he loved most at risk. "Are you okay, Mr. Salazar?" asked the nurse, noticing his distant gaze. "I'm fine," he responded in a deep voice, even though he wasn't. Nothing in his life was right at that moment. When Sofia woke up, Eduardo was sitting beside her. The girl looked at him with a faint smile, which he returned with warmth he didn't feel. "Daddy, I dreamt that Mom was here," Sofia said, with a tone mixing hope and melancholy. Eduardo took his daughter's hand and squeezed it gently. "Mom loved you very much, Sofia. In her own way, she always wanted to protect you." The words left his lips before he could stop them. He wasn't sure if they were true or if he was just trying to comfort her, but at that moment, it didn't matter. The little one didn't need any more pain. Sofia nodded, as if she understood something he couldn't fully grasp. She then changed the subject, talking about the drawings she had made at the hospital and how she wanted to go home. Eduardo listened carefully, but every word reminded him that he needed to act quickly. The threat was still there, and now he knew he couldn't underestimate it. That night, while Sofia slept, Eduardo sat in a chair beside her bed, going over the documents he had brought from home. There was something he was missing, a detail he couldn't connect. Finally, his eyes stopped on a name that appeared repeatedly in the papers, Martinez. He decided to look for more information. Hours later, sitting in an internet cafe near the hospital, Eduardo discovered that Martinez was a businessman who had been investigated for money laundering and arms trafficking. Apparently, Valeria had worked for him, possibly to pay off debts she had accumulated. What was more unsettling was that Martinez was still active and had connections with the same people now looking for something from him. Eduardo closed the computer with a sigh. He had been immersed in complex battles during his time in the Navy, but this was different. There were no weapons, no clear orders, just a puzzle of secrets and lies that was pushing him to his limit. The following days were filled with tension. Eduardo began noticing strange things. First, a black car parked near the hospital that seemed to be there longer than it should have been. Then, phone calls to Sofia's room phone that ended in silence when he picked up. Finally, one night, while returning to the hospital after buying something to eat, he noticed that someone was following him. He decided not to go directly back to the hospital. Instead, he turned down a side street and waited in a dark corner. When the man following him passed by, Eduardo intercepted him, pinning him against the wall. "Who are you? What do you want?" he asked in a low, dangerous voice. The man, a short-haired, nervous-looking guy, tried to break free, but Eduardo held him firmly. "I just wanted to talk to you," the man said, trying to sound calm. "I work for someone interested in what your wife left behind." Eduardo felt a mix of anger and despair. What did she leave? He demanded to know. Documents, something valuable. She got involved in things she didn't understand, and now you and your daughter are in the middle of it. Eduardo released him, feeling rage consuming him. Before he could say anything else, the man fled, disappearing into the darkness. He returned to the hospital with a sense of unease he couldn't shake. Sofia greeted him with a smile, but he barely responded. He knew he had to keep her safe, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. He decided to ask for help. That same night, he called a friend from the Navy, a man named Andres who had experience in intelligence. He explained the situation and asked for advice. "You're playing with fire, Eduardo," Andres said. "But if anyone can get out of this, it's you. Tell me what you need." Eduardo explained what he had discovered and asked for help tracking Martinez and Raul. Andres promised to do what he could, but also warned him to be careful. Meanwhile, the days at the hospital became a mix of routine and tension. Sofia was slowly improving, but Eduardo couldn't ignore the signs of danger. He knew the mafia wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, and the only way to protect his daughter was to face them head-on. Finally, one night, Andres called with news. "I found something about Martinez. He has a warehouse on the outskirts of the city that he uses as a base. If there's anything important, it's probably there." Eduardo thanked him for the information and hung up. He knew what he had to do. The next day, he left Sofia under the care of a trusted nurse and headed to the warehouse. The place was guarded by 2 men, but Eduardo knew how to move without being detected. He slipped around the side and managed to get inside. Once inside, he found boxes full of papers and equipment. After searching for what felt like an eternity, he found a folder with the name Valeria. He opened it with trembling hands and discovered a series of documents detailing illegal transactions, all linked to Martinez. But before he could leave, he heard voices. He hid behind some boxes and saw 2 men enter, talking about what they would do with the captain. Eduardo realized at that moment that time was running out. He stuffed the documents into his jacket and waited for the right moment to escape. That night, Eduardo returned to the hospital with a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had gotten the documents, but he knew the mafiosos wouldn't stop. He looked at Sofia while she slept and promised that he wouldn't let anything happen to her. The secrets of Valeria had put their lives at risk, but they had also given him the strength to fight for what truly mattered. The shadow of the mafia still loomed, but Eduardo was determined to face it, no matter the consequences. What mattered now was protecting his daughter and finding a way to close this dark chapter of their lives. Eduardo hadn't closed his eyes since returning to the hospital with the documents hidden under his jacket. Every time he tried to relax, the images of the men in the warehouse returned to his mind, mixed with Sofia's face and the voice of Valeria apologizing in that letter he still carried with him. The folder he had found contained enough information to implicate Martinez in a network of corruption and crimes, but there was also something else: coordinates. A specific point marked with a cross, something Eduardo could not ignore. Sofia woke up that morning with a little more color in her cheeks. Eduardo sat down next to her bed and stroked her hair, trying to calm his inner storm. "How are you feeling today?" he asked with a smile that tried to look genuine. "Better. I want to go home," the little girl replied, with a mix of sadness and hope. Eduardo nodded, though he knew that home was a concept that needed to be redefined. His home was no longer the safe place it should have been. Something else had begun to grow in him, the sense that his past was intertwined with the present in a way that he couldn't ignore. "Soon, Sofia. But I need you to keep being strong, okay?" he said, holding her small hand. The little girl nodded, showing more courage than Eduardo felt at that moment. She didn't know the dangers that threatened them, nor the difficult decisions he would have to make in the coming days. That afternoon, Eduardo went back home. Each step toward the basement was filled with an inexplicable fear. There was something about that place that had always unsettled him, but now he knew he had to confront it. He grabbed a flashlight and began inspecting every corner, looking for something that matched the coordinates he had found. Hours passed before he found a small door hidden behind some old boxes. It was a compartment he had never noticed, sealed with a rusty lock. Eduardo used a tool to open it and found a metal chest. He lifted it with effort and brought it to the light. Inside, he found more papers, money, and a key. But what caught his attention the most was a hard drive. He plugged it into his computer, and what he discovered made his blood run cold. It was a collection of videos and documents detailing Martinez's operations and his network, including recorded meetings with Valeria. In one of the videos, she looked nervous, but clearly spoke about her role in the scheme. This is enough to take them down," muttered Eduardo, feeling a mix of relief and despair. He had found the evidence the mafiosos wanted to destroy, but he also knew they were now more in danger than ever. The next day, Eduardo decided to talk to Andres. He needed a strategy, someone he could trust to deal with the information he had. He called him and asked to meet in a safe place. When he showed him the videos and documents, Andres leaned forward, looking concerned. "This is bigger than I thought, Eduardo. Martinez is not just a mafioso. He has connections with politicians and businessmen. If this gets out, heads will roll. Isn't that what we want?" asked Eduardo, staring at his friend. "Yes, but you have to be careful. You're not alone in this. Sofia is in danger, and these men won't stop. First, you need a plan." Andres suggested he contact a trusted journalist who could safely publish the information. He also advised Eduardo to temporarily leave the hospital and hide with Sofia in a less visible location. Eduardo nodded, though his mind was still full of questions. What else didn't he know? How deep had Valeria gotten into this dark world? That night, as he packed what he needed to leave the hospital, Sofia looked at him with curiosity. "Where are we going, Daddy?" she asked, her voice soft but alert. Eduardo knelt in front of her and took her hands. "To a place where we can be safe. I need you to trust me, okay?" Sofia nodded, although her eyes reflected more concern than Eduardo wanted to admit. He carefully lifted her, making sure not to disconnect any monitors or tubes that were still keeping her stable, and they left the hospital in silence. They took refuge in a small motel outside the city. The place was modest, but Eduardo had taken precautions to ensure that no one followed them. Each night, he reviewed the documents and videos, looking for any detail that could help him understand the magnitude of the problem. Sofia, on her part, began to regain strength, but her silence was more eloquent than any word. One night, as they sat together watching TV, Sofia finally spoke. "Daddy, was Mommy in trouble?" she asked, her voice full of uncertainty. Eduardo looked at her with eyes full of pain. "Yes, honey. But that doesn't change how much she loved you. She made mistakes, but she also tried to protect you." Sofia stared at him before responding. "I miss her, even though sometimes she scared me. But I miss her." Eduardo hugged her, feeling the weight of her innocence and pain mixed together. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he couldn't let Valeria's legacy define his daughter's future. The next day, Andres called him with troubling news. "Martinez knows you have something, Eduardo. My contacts say he's desperate and moving his pieces. You need to act fast." Eduardo knew the time had come. He contacted the journalist Andres had recommended, and they arranged to meet in a safe place. In the meantime, he hid the documents and videos in a spot where only he could find them. When the meeting time arrived, he took Sofia with him, making sure she was protected at all times. The journalist, a middle-aged man with a sharp look, listened carefully as Eduardo explained everything. In the end, he nodded. "This could change a lot of things, but it will also put a target on your back. Are you ready for that?" Eduardo looked at him with determination. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect my daughter." The journalist promised to handle the information carefully and publish everything once he had the chance. Eduardo returned to the motel with Sofia, knowing the storm was about to break. That night, while Sofia slept, Eduardo sat by her bed with a gun he had obtained through Andres. He knew Martinez's men wouldn't stop easily, but he was ready to face them. He had come too far to give up now. The future was still uncertain, but Eduardo knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't let the past destroy the only thing he had left. Sofia was his reason to keep fighting, and he was willing to make any sacrifice to ensure she had a better future. Eduardo looked out the motel room window, the gun resting on the table within reach. The darkness outside seemed impenetrable, but he knew he wasn't alone. He could feel it, an instinct honed over years of dangerous missions in the Marines. Out there, somewhere, were Martinez's men, waiting, watching for their chance. Inside, Sofia slept soundly, unaware of the danger approaching. Every sound that broke the silence made Eduardo tense. The snap of branches, the distant murmur of a car passing down the road, everything felt like a threat. His mind ran through the plan again, looking for weaknesses, vulnerabilities. He had done everything he could to keep Sofia safe, but now, more than ever, he felt that time was running out. It had been days since he'd slept more than a few minutes at a time, but his body had grown accustomed to the fatigue. He turned to the bed where Sofia rested, wrapped in a blanket he'd brought from home. Her small figure looked so fragile that Eduardo felt a pang in his chest. She shouldn't be living through this. She was just a child. Sofia's voice broke him from his thoughts. "Daddy," she said, in a sleepy murmur, slowly opening her eyes. Eduardo moved closer and sat on the edge of her bed, stroking her hair. "I'm here, sweetheart. Everything will be okay. What's going on?" he asked, his voice weak but full of curiosity. "I'm just making sure we're safe. Don't worry, just rest." Sophia looked at him with tired but trusting eyes. Eduardo knew she didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation, but she trusted him. That trust was a burden he carried in his soul. Did Mom do this too? Sophia asked, surprising Eduardo. This? He repeated, trying to buy time. Stay awake all night to protect me. Eduardo swallowed and took his daughter's small hand. Mom did the best she could with what she knew. Now it's my turn to protect you, and I promise I won't fail you. Sophia closed her eyes, but Eduardo knew she wasn't fully asleep. He got up and returned to his post by the window. The night remained unnervingly calm. The first sign that something was wrong came around 3 a.m. A black car stopped in front of the motel, its lights off. Eduardo watched from the shadows, his heart pounding, but his mind cold and calculating. 2 men got out of the vehicle, both dressed in black, and cautiously walked toward the reception. Eduardo woke Sophia gently, covering her mouth with his hand to keep her from making noise. When she opened her eyes, scared, he whispered, "Listen, little one. We're going to play a game, okay? You need to stay quiet like a statue. No matter what happens, don't make a sound. Can you do that?" Sophia nodded, though tears started rolling down her cheeks. Eduardo hugged her quickly before guiding her to the bathroom, where he hid her behind the door. "Don't come out until I come for you. Promise me." "I promise, Daddy." He carefully closed the door and returned to the room, making sure the gun was loaded. His training told him that the best defense was surprise, so he prepared to strike before the intruders knew he was ready. The footsteps outside the room were slow but sure. Someone tested the doorknob. Eduardo positioned himself against the wall next to the door, waiting. When the lock began to give, he acted. He pushed the door hard, knocking the first man trying to enter off his feet. The second reacted quickly, drawing a weapon, but Eduardo was already on him. He used all his strength to disarm him, spinning the gun toward the man's chest and pulling the trigger. The sound of the shot echoed in the small motel. The first intruder tried to get up, but Eduardo quickly subdued him, pinning him to the ground. "Who sent you?" he asked harshly, pressing the gun to the man's head. "Martinez. He just wants what's his." "I don't have anything of his." "Why are you following me? We know you have the documents. We just want to avoid trouble. Hand everything over and we'll leave you alone." Eduardo felt a mix of anger and desperation. He knew it was a lie. These men wouldn't stop until they were dead, him and his daughter. Without wasting more time, he knocked the intruder unconscious with a precise blow and grabbed his weapons before returning to the bathroom. Sophia was sitting silently, hugging her knees. When Eduardo opened the door, she looked at him with terrified eyes. "Are you okay, my love?" he asked, lifting her into his arms. "I heard noise, Daddy." "What happened?" "Some bad men showed up, but you don't have to worry anymore. We're leaving here right now." Sophia didn't say anything else, just clung to his neck as he quickly gathered their things. They left the motel before reinforcements arrived. Eduardo knew they were now in a race against time. Andres called a few hours later when they were already in a safe place. "Are you okay?" "I heard something happened at the motel." "I'm fine, but now they know I'm not going to surrender. We need to speed up the plan." "Got it. Everything is set with the journalist. We just need a place and a time." Eduardo gave him the location where he had hidden the documents, and they decided to meet that night. In the meantime, he spent the day making sure Sophia was comfortable and calm. Though he tried to stay strong for her, he knew the stress was affecting her. It had to end as soon as possible. That night, the meeting was tense. Eduardo handed the documents to the journalist, who promised that the story would be in all the headlines by dawn. Meanwhile, Andres organized a small team to ensure that Eduardo and Sophia were protected. But Martinez wasn't going to wait to be exposed. Just a few hours later, more men arrived at the location where Eduardo and Sophia were hiding. This time, there was no time to hide. Eduardo grabbed Sophia and ran to the car, while Andres and his team faced the attackers. The gunshots filled the air, and Eduardo felt the weight of the situation like never before. Sophia was crying, but he couldn't stop. He drove as fast as he could to a place that only he knew, an old abandoned military shelter where he used to train. Once there, Eduardo chained the doors shut and made sure Sofia was safe. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "When is this going to end, Dad?" "Soon, sweetheart. Very soon." That night, while keeping watch outside, Eduardo knew he had reached the point of no return. Martinez had crossed the line, and he was ready to do whatever it took to protect his daughter. The final battle was near, and Eduardo knew he couldn't fail. Not this time. The abandoned military shelter was surrounded by an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of the wind filtering through the cracked concrete walls. Eduardo checked his gun while keeping a close eye on the makeshift monitor he had set up to watch the surroundings. Sofia was in a small adjacent room, resting on an old mattress she had found at the shelter. His daughter's face was a constant reminder of why he couldn't give up. He had faced storms at sea, dangers in distant lands, and decisions that could have cost him his life, but he had never felt a weight like this. Sofia's life was at stake, and he couldn't afford to fail. Sofia woke up a few hours later, her hair tangled and eyes swollen from exhaustion. She found her father sitting at a makeshift table, surrounded by maps and notes. The little girl walked over to him, her footsteps light on the cold cement floor. "Dad, are we still in danger?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. Eduardo looked up, setting the papers aside. He knelt in front of his daughter and took her hands. "We are, but I'm here to protect you. I won't let anyone hurt you." "Was Mom in danger too?" Sofia insisted. Eduardo took a deep breath before responding. "Yes, she was. But in the end, she tried to do the right thing. And now it's my turn to make sure we get through this together." The little girl nodded, though tears began to gather in her eyes. Eduardo hugged her tightly, promising himself he would do whatever it took to give her a better life. That night, while Sofia slept, Eduardo received a call from Andres. The journalist managed to publish the documents. "Martinez is under pressure, but that doesn't mean he'll stop. My contacts say he's planning a direct attack against you." "I already knew that," Eduardo replied firmly. "I'm not waiting to be found. I'm taking the fight to them." "Are you sure about this?" Andres asked, concern in his voice. "It's the only way to end this. I can't keep running with Sofia. I need to close this chapter once and for all." Andres was silent for a few seconds before responding. "I'll support you in whatever you need. But be careful, Eduardo. Martinez doesn't play fair." The next morning, Eduardo began preparing his plan. He knew Martinez had a hideout in a warehouse near the harbor, a place he used as a base of operations. He studied the area maps and knew exactly how to infiltrate. He also knew it was a risky move, but he had no other choice. Before leaving, he sat down next to Sofia. "Sweetheart, I need you to be brave for me, okay? I'm going out for a bit, but I'll come back for you. No matter what happens, stay here and don't open the door for anyone." Sofia looked at him with eyes full of fear. "What if you don't come back?" Eduardo took her face in his hands and looked into her eyes. "I'll be back. I promise." The girl nodded, though her body trembled. Eduardo hugged her once more before leaving Andres in charge of guarding the refuge. The warehouse near the port was guarded by several armed men, but Eduardo knew how to move undetected. He slipped through the shadows, using every corner and object to his advantage. He had learned to be invisible when necessary, and now he was using all those skills to get closer to his goal. He managed to get into the warehouse through a side entrance and began to explore the place. The hallways were filled with boxes and equipment, but Eduardo knew exactly what to look for. He had come for Martinez, but also for any additional evidence he could use to take him down. While he was checking one of the back rooms, he heard voices. He crept up carefully and saw Martinez talking to one of his men. The mobster was a bulky man with a cold gaze that seemed to pierce anyone who faced him. "We need to find the captain before it's too late," Martinez said. "That bastard has everything we need to end up in prison." Eduardo felt rage fill him, but he knew he had to wait for the right moment. He stayed silent, watching and memorizing every word. When Martinez finally separated from his men, Eduardo followed him. He found him in an improvised office, going through papers. He closed the door behind him and pointed his gun. "Martinez, this ends now," he said in a cold voice. The mobster looked up, surprised, but quickly regained his composure. The captain. I knew you'd eventually come looking for me. What do you think you're going to accomplish here? I'm going to make sure you never hurt anyone again." Martinez laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the room. "And what makes you think that you, a lone man, can stop me? Because I'm not alone. Your whole network is exposed. Your time is up." Before Martinez could respond, one of his men burst into the room. Eduardo reacted quickly, disarming him and restraining him. Martinez tried to escape in the chaos, but Eduardo caught up to him, pinning him against a table. "Where's the rest of the evidence?" he asked, pressing the gun to the mobster's head. "You don't know what you're doing, Captain. If you kill me, others will come. This doesn't end with me." Eduardo gritted his teeth, knowing Martinez was partly right. But he also knew that stopping him was a crucial step to protect Sofia and others who might be in danger. After incapacitating Martinez, Eduardo called Andres, who arrived with reinforcements to make sure the mobster was handed over to the authorities. As he watched Martinez being taken away, Eduardo felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He had won this battle, but he knew the war was far from over. He returned to the refuge hours later and found Sofia waiting for him at the door. The girl ran toward him and hugged him tightly. "I knew you'd come back, Daddy." Eduardo lifted her into his arms, feeling the weight of the past few days begin to fade. "I'll always come back for you, Sofia. Always." As he hugged her, he knew that, although there were still challenges ahead, he had done what was necessary to give his daughter a chance at a better future. The road wasn't finished, but at least now they could walk it together. The light of dawn filtered through the broken windows of the shelter, gently illuminating the faces of Eduardo and Sofia as they shared a moment of tranquility. Weeks had passed since the confrontation with Martinez, and although the most immediate threats seemed to have faded, Eduardo knew that the physical and emotional scars wouldn't disappear so quickly. Sofia looked at him with a faint smile as she finished her breakfast. "Are we moving again today, Dad?" she asked, her tone calm but expectant. Eduardo took a sip of coffee before responding. "No, sweetheart. Not today. I think it's time we start building something stable. I don't want us living in fear anymore." Sofia gazed at him intently, as if trying to read his thoughts. Her intelligence and sensitivity always amazed him, reminding him how much she had grown in such a short time, even though the circumstances hadn't been ideal. "What are we going to do now?" she asked, her tone more serious. Eduardo placed his cup on the makeshift table and leaned toward her. "We're going to find a new home. A place where you can be happy, where you can make friends, and where we can start over." Sofia nodded slowly, though her gaze reflected an echo of the fear they both had felt in recent months. Eduardo knew it would take time to heal those invisible wounds, but he also knew he couldn't fail her. Later, while they packed the few belongings they had accumulated in the shelter, Eduardo received a call from Andres. His friend's voice sounded more relaxed than usual, which gave Eduardo a small sigh of relief. "Martinez is officially out of the game. The journalist did an excellent job publishing all the evidence, and the authorities have already started dismantling his network. It's only a matter of time before the few remaining members surrender." "That's a relief, Andres. But what about us? Do you think we're still in danger?" "I can't say you're completely safe, Eduardo, but the blow you dealt to that organization was strong enough that they'll think twice before trying anything. My advice is to stick with your plan of staying under the radar for a while longer." Eduardo thanked Andres for everything and hung up, feeling a mix of relief and determination. The storm finally seemed to be subsiding, but there was still much work to do. A few days later, Eduardo and Sofia moved to a small village in the mountains. It was a peaceful place, far from the hustle and bustle of the city and the dark memories they both wanted to leave behind. The house they found was modest, with wooden walls and a fireplace that Sofia had already dubbed her favorite corner. As they unpacked, Eduardo realized how much he wished this place could be a true home for them. He had spent much of his life on the move, adapting to the demands of his career and the tragedies of his past. Now, for the first time, he had the chance to build something permanent. "Dad, can I decorate my room?" Sofia asked, holding a box full of drawings she had made in the hospital. "Of course, sweetheart. This is your space. Make it however you like." Sophia's smile lit up the room, and Eduardo felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path. As the days turned into weeks, Eduardo and Sophia began to adjust to their new life. He found a job as a mechanic in the village, something that kept him busy and allowed him to learn a new skill. Sophia, on the other hand, started attending the local school, though the first few days were difficult. Eduardo encouraged her every morning, reminding her how brave she was. "Anytime you feel scared, just think about how strong you've been so far," he'd say as he walked her to school. Sophia nodded, and although sometimes it was hard for her to say goodbye at the door, Eduardo saw how she slowly began to make friends and trust others. One evening, as they had dinner together, Sophia broke the silence with a question that Eduardo hadn't expected. "Dad, do you think Mom would be proud of us?" The question took him by surprise, but he didn't want to show it. He looked at his daughter with tenderness before responding. "I think she would. Despite everything, she always wanted what was best for you. I'm sure she would be happy to see how far you've come." Sophia nodded, but her eyes shone with unshed tears. Eduardo leaned toward her and took her hand. "No matter what happens, we'll always carry Mom with us. In our memories, in the things we learned from her. But now we have to look ahead, because that's what she would have wanted for us." The little girl smiled weakly, and Eduardo felt that they had taken another small step toward healing. Over time, Eduardo began to feel more at peace with himself. He spent his afternoons helping Sophia with her homework or playing with her in the backyard. Sometimes, he would watch her run between the trees and pause to observe her, grateful for the chance to see her grow. Each laugh, each small victory, was a reminder that they had survived and were building something beautiful from the ashes. One day, as they walked together through the nearby woods, Sophia stopped and looked at her father seriously. "Dad, I'm not scared anymore." Eduardo knelt in front of her, feeling her words fill him with pride and emotion. "That's because you're the bravest girl I know." Sophia hugged him tightly, and in that moment, Eduardo knew that, although the road had been long and full of challenges, they had arrived at a place where they could begin anew. They had faced their fears, their mistakes, and their losses, and had come out stronger on the other side. The past never fully disappears, but Eduardo had learned to accept it as part of his story. Now, with Sophia by his side and a new life ahead, he was ready to write the next chapter. It wouldn't be easy, but after everything they had overcome, he knew they could face anything together. Weeks later, life in the small town had begun to stabilize for Eduardo and Sophia. Each day seemed simpler than the last, as if the dark clouds that had followed them were finally dissipating. But fate still had an unexpected twist prepared for them, one that would change their lives in a way that even Eduardo couldn't have anticipated. One afternoon, while Eduardo was fixing an old bicycle in the makeshift workshop at home, he heard a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found a woman who appeared to have traveled a long way. Her dark hair was disheveled, but her eyes were bright with determination. "Eduardo Salazar?" the woman asked, her voice filled with emotion. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" he replied, trying to recognize her. The woman took a deep breath before introducing herself. "I'm Pia, Valeria's sister. I've been looking for you and Sophia ever since I found out what happened. I needed to make sure you were both okay." Eduardo stood in silence for a moment, processing her words. He vaguely remembered Pia, but they hadn't been in contact for years. Before he could answer, Sophia appeared behind him, curious to know who was at the door. "Who's that, Daddy?" she asked, holding onto his leg. Pia lowered her gaze, and her eyes filled with tears when she saw her niece. "Hello, Sophia. I'm your Aunt Pia. I'm so happy to see you." The little girl looked at Eduardo, seeking his approval. He nodded with a small smile, and Sophia took a step forward, studying Pia cautiously. "Are you really Mommy's sister?" she asked. "Yes, I am. And I want to help you and your dad. I want to be here for you." Sophia hesitated for a moment before hugging her. Pia closed her eyes and let tears roll down her cheeks as she hugged her tightly. In the following days, Pia moved in with them, bringing a fresh, positive energy. Eduardo, though nervous at first about sharing his home, soon realized that Pia's presence was a blessing. She had a special way of connecting with Sofia, making her laugh and reminding her that she still had a family that loved her. One afternoon, while they were preparing dinner in the kitchen, Pia looked at Eduardo. "Thank you for taking such good care of her, Eduardo. I know it hasn't been easy for you. She's my daughter." "I'd do anything for her," he replied with a slight smile. "I know. But now you're not alone. We're in this together." Eduardo nodded, feeling the weight he had carried for so long begin to lift. He didn't have to do it all on his own. Pia's arrival also brought changes to Sofia's life. For the first time in a long while, she seemed completely happy. She began to participate more actively at school, and the neighbors in the village, who had already noticed the girl's courage, organized a small welcome party for her. When the day came, the house was filled with balloons, laughter, and friendly voices. The neighbors brought food, decorated the yard, and made sure that Sofia felt like the most special person in the world. "You're a very brave girl, Sofia," one neighbor said as she handed her a bouquet of flowers. "We're so proud of you." "Thank you," the girl replied, blushing but smiling broadly. Another neighbor, an elderly man who had always been kind to Eduardo, approached and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "You're a champion, Sofia. This town is lucky to have you here." Sofia looked at her father and aunt, who returned a warm smile. Then she raised her arms and shouted joyfully, "I love you all." The guests laughed and applauded as they released balloons that soared into the sky, carrying with them the wishes of a new beginning. That night, after the guests left and the house fell silent, Eduardo, Pia, and Sofia sat together in the living room, watching the last embers of the fireplace. "Aunt Pia, will you stay with us forever?" Sofia asked, her eyes shining with hope. Pia took her niece's hand and looked at her tenderly. "Of course, my girl. We'll live together, the three of us, you, your dad, and me. I won't let anything separate us." Sofia smiled and hugged her aunt tightly, while Eduardo watched, feeling a peace he hadn't felt in years. "We're building something beautiful here, and nothing will take it away from us," Eduardo said, looking at both of them with gratitude. In the days that followed, Eduardo, Sofia, and Pia continued to adapt to their new life. Each day served as a reminder that, despite the trials and pain, there was always room for hope and rebuilding. Together, they faced every challenge with the certainty that as long as they were united, they could overcome anything. Life wouldn't always be perfect, but now they had something that once seemed unreachable, a true home. And for Sofia, a new beginning full of love and promises. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments what you would do in a similar situation. We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a sign of support. This motivates us to keep posting exciting stories nearly every day. Don't miss the next amazing story coming up on your screen. We greatly appreciate having you here with us, and you can click on the links currently appearing on your screen. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. A hug.